Thanks very much. Very much for asking me to come and speak. As has been said, my name is Marisa Haetzman. I'm currently a writer of historical crime fiction with my husband, Christopher Brookmyre. And I'm going to talk to you today about what inspired my career change from a consultant in anaesthesia and how an interest in medical history became a series of novels. So in 2013, having been a consultant anaesthetist for a little over 10 years, I've done anaesthetics for 20 years, but I was a consultant for just over 10, I decided to take a year out and return to university and study for a master's degree in the history of medicine. And as was said in the introduction, for my master's dissertation, I did some research into the early use of ether and chloroform at the maternity hospital in Edinburgh, which led me to this man, James Young Simpson, who was Professor of Midwifery at the University of Edinburgh at the time. And the more I read about him, the more fascinating he became. Now, you can't talk about James Young Simpson without talking about chloroform, the discovery that made him famous. But in order to understand just how significant this discovery was, it's necessary to provide a little bit of context. In the early 1800s, before anaesthesia, childbirth was life-threateningly dangerous, with a maternal mortality rate of something in the region of 1 in 200. And surgery was performed only as a last resort and without much in the way of pain relief. The only mercy a surgeon could show was to be as swift as possible, and many surgeons at the time claimed that they could amputate a limb, a lower limb, in less than 90 seconds. Chloroform was not the first anaesthetic to be discovered and put to use. The anaesthetic effects of ether were successfully demonstrated at the Massachusetts General Hospital in October of 1846. It was taken up with alacrity by many surgeons, and James Young Simpson became an early adopter. But its use in obstetrics was controversial. Many obstetricians were rightly concerned about possible complications, citing concerns about prolonging labour and increasing the risk of hemorrhage. But others thought that pain in labour was either insignificant or necessary for the moral fortitude of the mother. The Bible was frequently referred to at the time, and the book of Genesis quoted from, "In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children." It was suggested that the pain of labour was therefore divinely ordained and should not be interfered with. Simpson rejected all of these objections and robustly defended a woman's right to pain relief in labour. However, it soon became clear that ether was quite tricky stuff to use. The results when using it were often unreliable, and some surgeons quickly abandoned it altogether. So in 1847, Simpson took it upon himself and embarked upon a mission to find, in his words, a better drowsy syrup than ether. And all through the summer, he inhaled a variety of chemical samples procured from various different sources around his dining room table at 52 Queen Street, just along the road here. This was not without considerable risk to himself. Numerous substances that he inhaled are now known to be very toxic and resulted in headaches, dyspepsia, and sometimes such severe reactions that he had to take to his bed for several days at a time. His next-door neighbour at the time was Professor Miller, who was Professor of Surgery at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, and he used to pop by of a morning to make sure that Simpson had made it through the night. On the 4th of November, Simpson found what he'd been looking for. Having exhausted his supply of samples, he remembered that there was a bottle of something at the back of the mahogany sideboard that had been discarded earlier because it was a very viscous liquid and he didn't think that it would be useful at all. But having nothing else to try, he duly poured a sample into a tumbler and along with his assistants, James Matthews Duncan and George Keith, they all inhaled the vapour, and in Simpson's own words, they were all under the mahogany in a thrice. So this was clearly much stronger and better than ether, and they continued with their experiments throughout the course of the evening, inviting everyone else who was in the house into the dining room to try it, and kept going until the sample was entirely used up. Once he had obtained some more chloroform, he used it on a patient a mere 4 days after its effects had been discovered. He championed its use in surgery and obstetrics, again against considerable opposition from fellow obstetricians. And this continued for a number of years. Oh, that's just a little diagram of the night of that experiment. So the objections continued for a number of years until Queen Victoria used chloroform in April 1853 during the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold. She wrote in her diary that it was soothing and delightful beyond measure. It then became quite difficult to argue that chloroform during labour was anti-scriptural because the head of the Church of England had just used it. So that's chloroform, the discovery that made Simpson famous. But Simpson himself was a really fascinating character, and his life was full of both triumph and tragedy. He was driven by a deep humanitarianism and a desire to alleviate pain in all its forms. He was quite from a humble background, being the son of a village baker, and yet he was as comfortable ministering to a duchess as to the fishwives of New Haven. He never forgot where he came from and would willingly toil up the longest flight of stairs in the old town of Edinburgh to see someone who claimed to be from his native Bathgate. His wife said of him that he was wont to spend his time with the poor and forget to collect the fees from the only patients who could afford to pay. But once his student debts had been repaid, he seemed to have very little interest in money. His butler had to check his pockets at the end of the day for any coins and monies that he had stuffed in there and then forgotten about. And it was said of him that he once stopped the rattling of a sash window with a folded up £10 note, which is quite a lot of money back in the 1840s. He lived with his family at 52 Queen Street. He saw patients there and kept a veritable menagerie of pets, including a Dalmatian called Glenn, who used to accompany him on his patient visits, and a parrot called Polly, who insisted on referring to itself as Dr. John Gray. His home was said to be like a hotel, full of doctors and their patients, visiting foreign dignitaries and cranks of all kinds. He received various honours during his lifetime, and in 1847, just before his discovery of chloroform, he was appointed as one of the Queen's physicians for Scotland, but he cared little for such titles. He said that flattery from the Queen was perhaps not common flattery, but that was as nothing as compared to having delivered a woman without pain under the influence of ether. I can think of no else, he said. There are many stories and anecdotes like this about Simpson, but I've only got 20 minutes, so I'm going to move on a little. Because basically I took this interest in a fascinating man who made one of the most significant discoveries of the 19th century and decided to turn this into a series of fictional novels. So the question is why? Why did I do that, or why did my writing partner and I decide to do that? I think there was probably a selfish reason initially, in that I felt the need to put my research to some use. And I thought that more people should know about Simpson and his contribution. I did a kind of straw poll around relatives to find out how much they knew about Simpson and chloroform and Edinburgh medicine in general, and the answer to that was not very much. And then my writing partner, being a novelist, a crime writer of many years' experience, convinced me that this was a story worth telling. But how to tell the story? How do you take all of this information and turn it into a novel that people might want to read? Well, there were already many excellent biographies about Simpson, so simply retelling his life story seemed to be redundant. So we decided to take two fictional protagonists, one male, one female, and drop them into Simpson's world, into Simpson's household, to let him be their mentor, to teach them and the reader about 19th century medicine. Crime fiction seemed to be an obvious choice. Maybe it doesn't seem obvious to everyone, but it seemed an obvious choice of genre to us because my co-author was an established crime writer. And crime is also where the inequalities in a society are most conspicuously manifest, and it is a useful vehicle for exploring the issues afflicting a society at any particular time. So there are currently, 4 novels now. This slide shows the first 3 novels in the series. And in addition to exploring various aspects of Simpson's life, the books have dealt with a variety of themes, including the 19th century attitudes to women, abortion, mercy killing, baby farming, medical charlatans and quackery, and the tension between altruism and ambition in 19th century medical practice. So it's not just about Simpson, although he was the main inspiration for writing. It's a bit broader than that, and it does deal with a lot of very fascinating and disturbing aspects of the 19th century. We have at all times tried to be very strict with ourselves and remain true to the facts as much as possible, so that all of the medical cases that appear in the books have been drawn from contemporary case books and case reports in the literature of the time, and any crimes that appear in the books are based on real crimes and are not the product of our collective imagination. For me, the experience of researching and writing these books has been both challenging and rewarding, and I would like to think that perhaps a few more people know about Simpson, his achievements, and why we should all be in his debt. Thanks very much.